All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and this is the real part now, so enough with the bad pirate jokes. Good afternoon. My name's Andy Frye, and welcome. We're going to talk today about probably one of the most significant questions that I think Christians handle themselves and that non-Christians pose to us. And that is, if God is good, why do bad things happen? Why does suffering happen? Why does evil exist? It's a big question. So before I get into that, let me just introduce myself a little bit, because I think that'd be polite. I am normally a public high school teacher in Grants Pass, Oregon, so here in my home state. I also spend my summers traveling with a group called Worldview Academy. So if you're having a good time today, we do camp for a week doing this stuff. Apologetics, Christian worldview. Next summer we'll be at Corbin University. You can see the dates up there. And then we'll also be at Seattle Pacific the following week. I will actually be at those camps, I think. We have a couple different teams that travel around, but I'm supposed to be on the West Coast next year. So if that's something you're interested in, I know Roy's daughter's gone. You talk to Roy and he'll tell you what it's really like. And you can check out our website, which is worldview.org. I'm one of the speakers. We have several others. And so we do a week at a college university as camp, and we do apologetics and worldview, and we don't just talk about it, we do some practicing with it as well. So, and we have a lot of fun, and we do a lot of intense thinking about what it means to be Christian, how you apply that to the world, that's your worldview, and about how to know why you believe what you believe, which is why you're here today. That's what Ambassadors Forum does all year long here. So I'm here as their guest as well, good people. So, all right, so that's a little bit about me, and if you want to ask more questions about Worldview Academy afterwards, love to talk to you. But let's get into today's question. If God is good, then why? Why suffering? Why evil? And I'll tell you right now, so I tend to move kind of fast and put way too many words on my slides or graphics, people tell me. But if you want to email me, it's very simple, afrye@worldview.org. You can have this whole slideshow. Just when you get home, shoot me an email. I'll send it back to you. Happy to do that. And again, if you miss it now, you can just ask me at the end. I actually want to begin with a story about a guy named Jack. Jack lived over 100 years ago. Jack lived in Britain, and of course, 100 years ago, medicine wasn't what it was. Jack had a very brutal experience in childhood. He watched his mother die slowly of cancer. Those days you died in the home. When his mother died, Jack was sent by his father to a boarding school, and that didn't work out so well. He suffered some abusive things there and eventually went to another teacher. Now, Jack was very smart, and so Jack eventually found himself as a new student at Oxford University. But he happened to be at Oxford when the First World War broke out. And so like many other young men, he found himself in the trenches in World War I. And there Jack saw his best friend blown to bits and suffered things so horrible that we don't even know totally what he went through. He didn't really talk about it much. He eventually comes home to be a young professor at Oxford. And Jack decides he does not believe in God. Whatever childhood faith he had been raised with, he throws aside. He says, if God is good, how can such evil, horrific things happen, both to me and in the war? He's an atheist, and he's angry at this God that does not exist. And this is typical of a lot of people you meet that say, if God is good, why do bad things happen? That is, it's not just an academic question, it's often a personal question. We're going to come back to Jack's story in a little bit. So, this is a powerful question. This is a question sometimes you might go, don't really know how to answer that. It's a difficult question. And again, it's one you've probably asked as well. Many Christians struggle. Despite our faith in God, sometimes, especially if we're going through hard times, God, if you're good, why are you allowing this to happen? So we're going to solve it in 40 minutes. No, that's a joke. We're not going to solve it in 40 minutes. was asked to do a talk on this at a church up in Vancouver, and that one went 5 hours or five 1-hour sessions. Because once you start poking into this question, it brings up a lot of other questions. So we're going to cut to the chase here and try to answer some of it. I'm not going to tell you I can answer all of it. In fact, even with 5 hours, I can't answer all of it. Because we're trying to explain what is God thinking. Clearly, I can't do that fully. And yet, I would say that as Christians, we have the only answer, even if we only have it in part, that makes any sense of evil and suffering in the world at all. So, I want to acknowledge that, first of all, this is a poignant question. You know what poignant means, right? How many of you watched a movie, or sometimes if it's really good, even an ad, and teared up a little bit, right? I mean, how many of you have ever teared up in an ad? Yeah. Well, because you're a dad, right? Yeah, and there's probably a little kid in it, and the kid was suffering. It was a 30-second ad. You're in 15 seconds, you're like, I have a daughter too. So poignant means it touches our heart. It touches our emotions. If I were talking to you and you were going through suffering, I would not give you this lecture. So Christians, if somebody is suffering, this is not the way to talk to them. This is going to be very academic and heady. In fact, maybe you're asking this question right now because you are going through suffering. If I were to sit down with you over a cup of coffee, Jesus says we're to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. So what I'm about to do is kind of academic. That is not the way we deal with somebody who is actually suffering, Christian or non-Christian, right? That's a heart thing most of all. And I get that. I want to tell you, I get that if that's you, and we need to understand that. I've heard Christians say, well, you shouldn't question God. That's nonsense. They clearly haven't read the Psalms. David has some big questions of God. Some of the prophets do that. Jacob actually wrestles with God, like physically wrestles with God, gets his hip dislocated, but wrestles with God. God is big enough to handle our tough questions, right? We see the prophet Jeremiah say, I would speak with you. He's addressing God. I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do the faithless have it so easy? Right? Now again, when we question God, sometimes like a 4-year-old banging our fist on daddy's shin saying, why, daddy, why? But a good father looks down and says, I get it. I get you don't understand this. This is a proper question to ask. Also, we need to recognize that this is a question that's meant to provoke. When an atheist says to us, I can't believe in God, as Jack said, I can't believe in God, it is because they cannot reconcile the alleged goodness of God with the suffering they see. J.L. Mackie, an atheist philosopher, says, a holy, good, omnipotent being would eliminate evil completely. If there really are evils, then there cannot be any such being. But I want you to notice something. Mr. Mackie is already in trouble. He's admitted his problem in there, which I highlighted for you to make it easy. See, if there isn't a God, then that which you are calling evil, well, then how is it evil? Where does the concept of evil come from without a God to make the moral law that says something is evil? And Mackie is saying, I don't believe in God because if God was powerful and good, there wouldn't be evils if they exist. Wait a minute, I have a problem. That brings us to the next point, which is this. The question pokes at the questioner. It's a probing question. Gabriel Marcel was a French philosopher, an atheist, said there's nothing is true, nothing is real, nothing is good, nothing is evil. He was in France, and the Nazis invaded France. Marcel, for the next few years, saw what the Nazis did in his country. By the end of the war, he was a believer in God. And his friends said to him, you're a philosopher. You've literally written books about there being nothing true, nothing real. He said, yes, but I began to believe in evil because I saw it. I couldn't avoid it. And when I began to believe in evil, I had to believe in good. And when I had to believe in good, I had to ask myself where it came from. And so Marcel says this: the question of evil is a mystery because the problem encroaches upon itself by entangling the questioner in the question. As soon as you question God, why, you're part of the problem. You're part of the situation. Okay, fine, get rid of God. What's your why? So this is an apologetics question back at the questioner. Again, not to be arrogant or confronting, but to say, if you ask me as a Christian to explain evil, fine, fair, and I'll admit I can't totally explain it. When I'm done with my explanation, as good or bad as it may be, I'd love to hear yours. It seems to me that would be a fair question to ask. Lastly, I'm going to admit, and I've admitted already, I can't answer all of this because I'm not God. Think about the story of Job. Anybody know the story of Job? You all read the book? Okay. Scene one, think of it like a movie. Scene one, God in heaven with the great council. The accuser comes to God and says, I want to go after Job because I think he'll question you. God says, all right, don't kill him, but you can do what you want to do. The rest of the book, what happens, right? Job loses everything. His 3 loser friends come and try to explain everything about God, and that doesn't work out so well. God shows up and said, y'all shut up. And God talks for a while, and Job ends up saying, look, I still don't get it, but even if you kill me, I'm not going to quit serving you. You notice at the end of the movie, the end of the book, Job wasn't in scene 1. He never knows about scene 1. He has no idea until he dies why any of that happened. He never gets the why. Go back and read it. So some things we can explain. God is under no obligation to explain everything he's thinking to us, and if he did, our heads would explode anyway. When my kids were little, there were a couple times I had to say no. Now my son, who's now 22, I think at 6, I pegged him for law school because that kid could ask questions about everything. He could argue everything, and the darn little booger, sometimes I found myself agreeing with him like, that's a great point. Wait a minute. I'm the adult here, he's 6. Smart kid. But there are times when I went, you're too young. If I tell you why you can't go over to this friend's house because maybe I know something about that family, it's not a safe place for you to be. But at 6, I can't tell you that because all you know is your little 6-year-old buddy and you are friends on the playground. Sometimes that's God with us. I'll tell you someday. As Paul say, we shall know in full, even as we are fully known. Right now, God says, I've given you as much as you can handle, maybe a little more than you can handle. Okay, so it's a perplexing question. So we need to think about the question a little more carefully because sometimes people confuse suffering and evil, and suffering and evil are connected, but they are not the same. So I think that's important to note for a minute, that there's a difference between suffering and evil. Because we tend to think, because of the world we live in, that suffering is just bad. But that's because we're modern people living in a secular, materialistic world. And sometimes even we in the church have been sucked into this idea. If you study every religion in the world, and I teach world religion, so I get to do that once in a while, all of them know that suffering is part of life. What they try to do is explain why suffering happens, just like I'm trying to do now. Now, some of them will talk about it being God wants you to suffer. Some will say it's karma. There's all sorts of explanations, but what they're all trying to do is give meaning to suffering. But we come into the modern world where we say, there is no God, you're an accident of nature, everything is evolved, you don't have a soul, we're just material beings. And in that kind of world, can suffering ever be good? In that kind of world, we're like animals. Animals flee suffering and move toward pleasure. And maybe I've just sort of described our world, our culture. So in a world where in a society where the whole point of existence is to feel good, what good can suffering ever be? But most worldviews, most older cultures at least understood that suffering is part of life. And what we really want is to be able to transcend suffering by finding a meaning in our suffering, a purpose for it. Now, if you've ever talked to old folks, right? Old folks like, well, kid, when you've lived a little longer, you'll understand, right? You'll get it, right? And so this guy here, Abraham Heschel, Jewish rabbi, says, I can almost hear him says, the man who hasn't suffered, what can he know anyway? This view that suffering actually teaches us something that we can't learn any other way. This is why when you want to discipline an animal, sometimes you inflict a little suffering. So my dog gets up and eats the food on the kitchen table. And since she's 9, clearly it's not working. And still, because she still does it, she gets a little whack on the nose. Bad dog. Run away from suffering. Good dog. Here's a biscuit. Right? That's how animals respond. And we spent a long time in the public schools teaching you that you're an animal. So guess what? That's how we view suffering. Run toward pleasure, run away from pain. But that's not really what we want. By the way, it's why so many people in our society today are struggling with suffering, because they've never been told there can be any meaning or purpose in suffering. If you're an athlete or a musician, you know how this works. Okay? Oops, I don't want that slide yet. How many of you are athletes? Any athletes in here? Right? Have you suffered? Yes. Have you suffered? Yes. I was a soccer coach for 22 years. I got to inflict suffering. That's another seminar. That's another seminar. Yeah. You may got to run 2 miles, coach. Yeah, run. Why aren't you running? Because I'll die. You need to run. So, okay. How many musicians? Any musicians in here? How many of you have suffered for music? Yeah, I'm a guitar player, right? Shredded calluses. Trumpet players, shredded lips. Yeah, drummers, just shredded everything. I was in a rock band for 10 years, Christian rock band, man. There's a reason we put drummers in cages. So, smell terrible. They're sweating. It's like, I'm playing guitar, like, oh, my fingers hurt. I look back at the drummer. He's just going, oh, God, I'm so tired, right? So, but in those cases, right, suffering is meant to do something good for us, to build us up. But it feels good. That suffering feels good not while you're suffering, of course. I hate running, too, which is weird because I played soccer for 40 years. Put a ball in front of me, I'm like a dog. Ooh, okay, I'll run. No ball, don't want to run. But that suffering yields meaning, purpose, because it makes us stronger, makes us a winner, allows us to play beautiful music. The problem is even we in the church have bought into some of those lies. One lie we bought into the church is that God exists to make me happy and give me comfortable circumstances. Sadly, there are churches that preach this as doctrine. That's not why God exists in your life. We've stopped believing that we exist to glorify God, that we are serving God, that we are called to do hard things. I mean, listen to Paul. He uses language like, I beat up my body, which, by the way, is athletic language. He's talking about like a training boxer. I run the race to the finish. I endure, right? Look at the New Testament. Endurance and discipline, all the things that you all know as athletes and musicians. That's how Paul describes the Christian life. He doesn't say God is here to make sure you have a lifetime supply of free lattes every day. Make sure that you never get sick and nothing ever goes wrong. Okay? Suffering can actually work to our good, and we bought into this lie. And the second lie is that good people don't suffer. So if I'm suffering, then maybe I'm evil, or there's no way suffering can be in God's plan. And I just say, really? Because Jesus was pretty good. Boy, did he suffer. So we have allowed sometimes those teachings of our culture to slip into our theology. Now, there are a lot of reasons why Christians suffer. This is not that lecture. Okay? Sometimes we suffer because we sin and God's disciplining us. Sometimes we suffer because we're dumb. Like, I can't believe it. I kept hitting myself in the head with a hammer and it hurt. God must not love me. No, you're stupid. This friend of mine says stupidity should hurt, okay? How many have done something dumb and it hurt? Yeah, well, okay, well, you were dumb, right? God's like, you're dumb. I gave you a brain, you didn't use it. That one's on you. Okay? Sometimes we suffer because other people sin and we are victimized by other people's evil. Sometimes we suffer because we live on a fallen planet, and part of the greater effect of the curse is we get hit by it. So just saying, oh, suffering is always bad as a Christian doesn't make sense. It's not a full understanding of where we're living. So I think of these quotes kind of help me out. I like good quotes. How many of you like good quotes? In my classroom, I have a quote of the day up on the whiteboard every day, so it's kind of fun. Andrew Solomon, I don't know if he's a Christian, TED Talk, but I just love the way he said this. We don't seek the painful experiences that shape our identity, but we seek our identities in the wake of painful experience. That's a very Christian thought, right? Nobody wants to suffer. Hey, I want to be comfortable all the time. I want that lifetime supply of free lattes. I want to win the lottery. I want to be rich. I keep telling God I can handle it. So far, he doesn't think so. But I'm working on him. But the reality is, in those hard times, in those painful moments, God uses that sometimes to cause us to face ourselves and say, who am I really? Again, athletes, musicians, you know, when you want to quit, you find out who you really are when you got to push through that last 10 minutes of the game where you don't think you have anything left. Or when you've almost got that piece down and your fingers are shredded, but you just got to do it a little bit more to get to the beauty. C.S. Lewis put it this way: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, but shouts to us in our pain. It is his megaphone to awaken a deaf world. Some of it's just we're so darn stubborn and rebellious. God says, I've got to let you go through this, because if I don't, you'll die. I was reading a book by a Christian doctor who worked with lepers. You know something interesting about leprosy? One of the first symptoms of leprosy is you don't feel anything in your fingers anymore. And this doctor said pain is a beautiful gift of God, because when you don't feel things on your fingers anymore, you tend to lean on things like hot stove. Somebody smell bacon? Something burning? That's you, Bob. Oh. Pain actually is an early warning system that God has given us as a gift to prevent further damage. Isn't that interesting? And sometimes the same thing is true of our soul. So again, meaning and perspective on suffering. Not all suffering is necessarily evil. But I will say this: all evil does cause suffering. You with me on that? You understand what I'm saying? Okay. Yeah.
Can you say that again?
Yes. Not all suffering is necessarily evil, but all evil does cause suffering. So the second thing I want to address, and I haven't yet got to the Christian answer, but I'm getting there, is that the skeptic has a dilemma. I hinted at this earlier. Let me, just so you know I'm not making stuff up, quote a particular famous skeptic who's made millions of dollars telling everybody how stupid Christians are, Mr. Richard Dawkins, Professor Dawkins. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces, right, there's no God, it's just evolved accident. Some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it either, nor any justice. There is no design, no purpose. I appreciate Dr. Dawkins. He is absolutely correct and honest. If you assume there is no God and we are simply made of matter, he's right. Now, I don't agree with his assumption. But if his assumption is that we are evolved animals, nothing but material, then there's no meaning to your suffering. It's completely pointless. And by the way, there's no justice, which means there's no evil at all. It doesn't exist. His words, not mine. You see, the skeptic has no answer, no hope. The Christian has hope even in our partial answer. Because no, I can't fully explain everything about God. I'm not God. But the skeptic's in a far worse position. If this life is completely meaningless, you and your suffering have no meaning. In such a view, then, pain and suffering are only interruptions. I mean, think how addicted we are to comfort in our modern world. If this temperature of this room was up or down by 10 degrees, you'd all complain. But 100 years ago, you got what you got. Right? If the sun was out, it was warm. If it wasn't, you were cold. Tough luck. Grab another animal skin and try to stay a little warmer. What? I have to wait how long to get my coffee? Are you kidding me? Hey, you get coffee. Right? We are very addicted to pleasure because not only because we have it, but because we, again, have taught people that they have a right to pleasure because pain is just an interruption in our continual pursuit of it if we're just an animal. Here's another problem. Nothing is unjust. Nothing actually can be evil. If there is evil and good, there must be a moral law. It's really hard to get there without a God. I taught community college for 19 years. I was telling Adrian this story earlier, I think. And I was doing my usual lecture. It was a night class on World War II. Kid raised his hand and says, I don't think there's anything evil about Hitler. Yeah, that froze the class, right? And I'm in community college. I'm not a Christian college, right? Everybody like turned at the kid. I went, well, this is about to get interesting. You know, the ones in the back woke up that had been sleeping. Not that I'm implying anything. You guys are with me. I get it. Okay? And so we had a very vigorous debate. And at the end I said, you're right. If this is just matter and there is no right or wrong in the universe, then there's nothing right or wrong about Hitler. All we can say is we won, he lost, might made right, because there really isn't right. I said, now, I think if you were in the camps watching your family go up the chimney, you might feel differently about this. And the rest of the class was going, it's a great conversation, something to think about. You see, in a secular worldview, suffering always wins. It can never be redeemed. There can never be a long-standing purpose. In the end, we all die, we all suffer, and there is no hope, and there is no meaning, and there is no purpose that really matters. That's the best you can do. Pretty hopeless. So that brings me back to Jack. Jack was struggling with his post-war stress, with his anger, but Jack was a pretty smart guy. And he realized he had a real problem. On top of that, he had a couple of friends that would talk to him that were believers in God. And Jack eventually realized, I can either be angry at God, but I have to admit he exists. Because it's intellectually stupid to be angry at a non-existent being. Or I can say God doesn't exist, but I have no right to be angry. It's just the way it is. And Jack eventually said, fine, I believe in God, but I still hate him. And I think God said, good. We've accomplished step one. You admit I'm here. It took a few more years, but Jack eventually began to think more deeply and have more conversations. And from that very kind of weird beginning point, he eventually came to believe in God. Now, his suffering didn't end. He never got married till his 50s. He finally did get married, and the woman he married was already dying of cancer. They just didn't know it. He later wrote about that and his grief as a Christian. But his belief in God never wavered after that. Now, you know Jack as C.S. Lewis. And you can read his books, Surprised by Joy and A Grief Observed, and you can read about his story in a lot of places. You see, it was the question of evil that actually was part of the apologetic, the argument about and for God, that brought him to think deeply about the existence of God, ultimately come to believe in God. And he realized you can only get angry at God if he exists. Otherwise, it just makes no sense. Like being angry at Thor. He's not real. Okay? And you're saying, well, you still haven't explained the Christian view. Nope. We're working our way there. But now we come to that. God does seem to have a dilemma. It's like, okay, fine, but we haven't yet faced the goodness and power of God, and yet, why does evil exist? Why is it even here? And yes, okay, Andy, suffering and evil are different, I get that, but we still haven't solved that. Why does evil exist if God is good and God is all-powerful? In fact, here's one that comes up. Again, you get into lots of questions here. If evil exists, did God create evil? How many of you have wondered that? Anybody wonder that? Yeah, a couple of you. So I'm going to say that evil is not a thing. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. By the way, before you get impressed at what I'm about to say, I stole it from St. Augustine, so don't be impressed. I didn't think of this. But it's a good way of thinking about it. So think back, Genesis. God creates everything, and everything was good. When God does good, does he do kinda? No, in fact, it says it was very good. So what's evil? How could God create evil and yet be part of the goodness of his creation? And I will say that God did not create evil, but what God did create was the ability of beings, the devil, that's a whole nother lecture we're not going to get into, and humans to choose to damage his good creation. So what is evil? Anything less than perfect goodness. You were created perfectly good. Well, at least Adam and Eve were created perfectly good. And when God calls something good, his standard is 100%, not 99%, 100%. So anything less than perfect goodness is not good. And of course, Satan, again, we don't know much about this. Satan gets to make some sort of choice to rebel against God. We know a lot more about us. We make a choice to rebel against God, and we diminish, we damage, we lessen God's goodness and perfect creation. And not only that, we affect all sorts of things in creation. Paul has some weird things about this, like all creation groans in anticipation of the coming of the sons of God. Like, man, I heard a tree kind of creaking in the wind the other day, but was that tree waiting for God to show up and fix everything? Apparently, I'm not sure what that means for a tree. But what it does tell us is that when we sinned, we damaged everything. We broke it, all of it. What does that mean? Now we're getting to stuff that I'm not sure how that works out in all the details. They might say, I don't know if I get that. Okay, well, let's think about this. Does light exist as a thing? Does light exist? Yes. Can we measure it? Yes. In waves? Yes. Okay. Physics, can take a little bit? Okay. Does darkness exist? Yes. No. Ask any physicist. Science, darkness is the absence of light. It is diminished pure light. How about heat and cold? Now you know where this is going, right? Does heat exist? Yes. Yes. Friction, we can measure it. What's cold? The absence of heat. No. Good job. You get a C+ today. Sorry, I'm not in teacher mode today. Right. So in a sense, right, we have some examples from the physical world about things that are real and yet are not things. They are the diminishment of a thing. By the way, somebody said, well, your God's so uptight and perfectionistic. I always think, well, that's funny. Because I think we're pretty perfectionist. Why does God have to be so uptight about the perfection of goodness? I mean, I'm mostly good. Okay, cool. Let's just imagine this for a minute. Let's say, I take Jim, our cameraman there, and say, Jim, you've been working so hard. Appreciate you, brother. We got you a suite tonight at the nicest hotel in Portland. 5-star hotel, downtown Portland. Dinner, 10,000 count sheets. I don't know if those exist, but anyway, the really, amazing ones, right? And we walk him into his suite and go, there you go. And he looks at the king-size bed with, massive, beautiful, thick mattress. And he's like, oh, it's going to be a good night. I go, there you go, Jim, hop in. He goes, all right. And he looks in there in the upper corner. I mean, it's a king-size bed, right? So there's a lot of room. But there in the upper corner is a little tiny pile of dog poop. Jim, you going to object to hopping in that bed? No, he's filming, yeah. Yeah, he shakes his head, no, I'm hopping in. Yeah. No, we probably would not get in that bed. Well, you're so picky because 99% of the bed is just fine. Why don't you want to hop in with the dog poop? Yeah, you'd be kind of picky too.
I move around in my sleep, so I would get
Yeah. Like, I don't think I'm getting in that bed. Well, most of it's okay. It's mostly good, right? But God says, no, here's the standard. So evil is real. It is any diminishment of God's law. Your body, made to be perfect, diminished by sin. Sex, God made it good, diminished when we use it sinfully. We can go on and on and on. Because Satan can't create. He can only damage what's been created. He is not the creator. So here's the real question. Let's come back to our question. Does God have a morally justifiable reason, consistent with his goodness, his power, his sovereignty, his character, for allowing a cosmos where somebody like me or you or any being could diminish what he created? Now I'm finally going to get to the answer. You ready for it? Here's the answer. Love. You know, you're thinking, okay, that's a weird answer. He allows evil to exist, or at least he allows his goodness to be diminished by us because of love? How does that work? That's the part where I'm a little baffled. But let me try. Not baffled by the fact that love could allow it, but by the time I get done, I hope you see by the fact that his love is so great for us that he allowed it to be that way. You are made in the image of God. One of the most fundamental things we say about God is that God is love. That's why the Trinity matters, by the way. Who did God love before any other being existed? He was a loving triune relationship within himself. So he makes us to bear his image. So one thing we can say for sure is you were made to love. You're made to love God and to love others. To love God and other images of God. You should know that if you know basic Bible verses. It's all over the place. You cannot force love. If I put a gun to somebody's head and say, do you love me? And they say yes, are they telling me the truth? No. No, you can't force love. In fact, love properly understood is a decision to put another person before you, to seek another's good. It's not a feeling. So we were created to love and be in relationship with God, but that cannot be forced. Now, lest the Calvinists and Arminians in the room get all uptight, let us just say that God is completely sovereign and we are completely responsible, and how that works is a theological mystery that I'm not going to unravel right now, despite whatever opinions you or I may have. But somehow in his total and perfect sovereignty, we were created to love, and we choose not to. If he had made us for anything other than love, he could have made us into robots, but he didn't. So we make moral choices that affect the universe. This is called moral agency. And on all sides of the theological debates, everybody agrees that humans, in the biblical view, have moral agency. That means you and I make moral choices that have consequences for the cosmos, or at least part of it. Anybody ever think it's unfair that Adam's sin messed up your world? I want to have a word with Adam when I get to heaven. And Eve. Both of them. They're both responsible. I got a buddy of mine, we played soccer until our knees gave out. We probably played about 8-9 years too long. We'd limp off the field. He's hilarious. You look at you hurt? Yeah, I'm hurt. You go, and he'd say, darn that, Adam. Wasn't for Adam, I'd still be playing, right? Darn that, Adam, right? But you know what? Here's the deal. I'm a victim of Adam's sin. But I also choose my sins, and I make victims of other people. All sin causes suffering. Even the secret ones, the ones that nobody will ever know about except me and God. Because when I sin, I damage my character, I diminish my character, and I relate to you and my children and my wife out of my character. So even though no one may ever know some of my sins, I still damage my ability to relate well, because that's what I was made to do, and I damage that. There are no secret sins. There are no victimless sins in the end. So yeah, I want to get mad at Adam, but I'm right there in the dock with him. I'm just as guilty. I make moral consequences that affect the universe, or at least part of it. That's the reality. Some people object to that, by the way. I want to say, well, grow up. Do you want to be a human or not? Here's the deal. God made you with a lot of cool stuff, so shoulder the responsibility for what you do with it. Christianity has a very robust and grown-up view of what it means to be human. But, as we all know now from the Avengers, with great power comes, look at you, you've been trained so well by the movies. We are perpetrators and victims. That's just the reality of our situation. So what's God's response to this? Why is this an answer that we can find hope and satisfaction in? Tim Keller puts it this way. Again, I love quotes. This is beautiful. He says, the deepest revelation of the character of God is in the weakness and suffering and death of the cross. So God creates this cosmos in which he says, I don't need to, I just want to be in relationship with these beings that I've created. And then we mess it up. Adam did it, we did it, you did it, I did it, Eve, we'll talk to Eve too, right? The whole gang. But we're all in this boat. And what does God do? He says, I am going to go through suffering and evil with them. I'm going to be treated evilly. I'm going to suffer physically. I'm even going to be separated from my Father. My God, why have you forsaken me? How can God separate from himself? The tearing of that. Like, we don't even understand that. But he says, I'm willing to do that because my answer to evil and suffering is not to turn you into robots so nothing bad ever happens, or even to make it all magically go away, but to walk through it with you and become part of that evil and suffering world to save you and bring meaning to all of it. In fact, to do even more than that, to turn it for good. This is one of the amazing things about the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview says evil is real, suffering is bad, but it's not meaningless. In fact, God delights in taking it and flipping it and turning it to good. Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, how many fans out there? Okay. How many read the book? How many saw the movie? Okay. Should read the book if you didn't see it. Right? But the idea that this moment of defeat is where the witch's power is broken. This, of course, is Lewis' story of the cross. That out of the greatest act of evil and suffering, the greatest good occurs. This is the Christian answer to evil and suffering. Even suffering and evil can be given meaning and turned to good. So here's my final answer to that question. If God is good, why? My answer is another question. It's not if God is good, why? It's if the Christian story is real, why did God create the world in the first place? I got to tell you, you people seem like really nice people. I've met a couple of you. But if I had to choose between my son and creating you, I don't create you. Sorry, tough luck. Yeah, sorry. You're all very thankful right now that I'm not God too, right? Because before time began, before creation, God knew exactly what was going to happen, didn't he? I don't know if, the Trinity's talking to itself. It's like, I'm going to make this whole earth thing, and it's going to go this way. And the Son says, yeah, I'm going to have to go to the cross. And the Father says, yep, you are. I don't know if Jesus said, can we have this cup not passed to me now? I don't know what was that conversation like? But in the end, Jesus was submissive to the Father. And they made it in the first place. So when I said the answer is love, the answer is not just that we can love God, but that God so loved us that he made this world knowing what would happen. I can't imagine that. I don't know how to explain that because that love is way bigger than any love I can imagine. That's the real question. So yeah, it's still a bit of a mystery to me, but in that mystery we find the grace of God. In that mystery we find the God that loves us so much that he knew what it would cost and made us anyway. The God who entered into that and loved us enough to die for us and enter into that suffering, and the God that gives us hope. Paul said in 1 Corinthians, we have been entrusted with the mysteries of the gospel. It's an odd phrase to use. Thanks for the mystery. Wait, why am I beginning with the mystery? But the mystery is that it doesn't make any sense from a human perspective. It's way too much love and grace to make sense. That's why it's mysterious. Because you scratch your heads and go, I wouldn't have done it that way. God goes, yeah, but I did. So I want to finish with this. The final answer to this is the empty tomb. And we see Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Great scene there where they're suffering and they're trying to get rid of the ring, and they're at this moment of crisis, and Sam says there's going to be a time when everything sad will come untrue, where suffering and evil are literally turned backwards, where death dies. where suffering is erased. I'm using words I don't even know fully how that works. And yet, that is why Paul says, where, O death, is your victory? And where, O death, is your sting? The God who used the greatest act of suffering and evil to save us will one day not only wipe every tear away, but the wounds and the scars themselves will disappear. And it's that hope in which Christians have the only answer that can make sense of evil and, yes, the suffering that goes with it. Tough question. We did it in 47 minutes. And there's probably a lot more to talk about. But hopefully that gives you a starting point to think about this question as you talk to your friends and think about it yourselves. God bless you guys. Thank you so much.